Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Kim Parlee. I apologize. I have a big bandage on my face, but I do know. So in case you want to email me, I'm aware that it's there. This week, Alberta announced what some are calling the most radical climate action policy shift ever seen, aimed to re-engineer the province into a low-carbon economy. Now let's take a look at some of the elements of the plan. Carbon tax of $20 a ton in 2017, up to $30 a ton in 2018. They're going to phase out their coal-based electricity plants by 2030. Renewable energy have increased incentives right across the board. The oil sands will pay carbon tax and hard emissions cap to them of 100 million tons. I'm not sure if it's tons or megatons a year, but we'll get back to that. And then methane emissions, 45% reduction from oil and gas by 2025. So what does this mean for those of you who are holding stocks in your portfolio? Is this good? Is this bad? How do you navigate this big change? We came with someone we rely on this kind of thing to give us the scoop on what's happening. Thomas George, he's portfolio manager at the TD Energy Fund. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Okay, very long-winded. I gave the kind of...
Yeah, you know, I think that was the synopsis.
Yeah, so that's the synopsis.
Yes.
What does it mean? Like, so now what? So, you know, we hear these things and like, I don't know.
Yes, so from our perspective, I think industry, everybody who had a vested interest in understanding where carbon legislation was going to go just needed clarity.
Right.
And we got a big piece of that clarity.
So is that where we saw not much reaction? Because it was more about ambiguity versus a policy coming
Yeah,
in.
you know, it always is, like, there's always the fear in stocks. Oh, you know, how bad is it going to be? It's always the downside.
Yeah.
And what we ultimately got was something very pragmatic,
yeah,
very constructive, and ultimately gets to the goal that both industry and, you know, and the climate policy wants to get to: reduced emissions and higher efficiency.
So what does this mean? So in terms of what are the emittances, if you will, right now by the Canadian oil sands players,
yeah,
versus where they're going? Because some might argue that maybe it's not onerous enough. If you've got four, you know, oil executives coming up and saying this is a good thing, you know, someone could critique the other side saying, should we be doing more?
Yeah, you know, and I guess the flip side of that is you don't have any of the stakeholders there.
Right.
And you say, you know, this is what the rule will be, and
yeah,
and people come, you know, what is this? So, you know, if I had to say, you know, why do you want the stakeholders there? Because everyone's got to stay at the table, and everyone can say, realistically, these are kind of the innovations that we've got happening in the background.
Yeah.
And these are the types of targets that we think are really achievable. And actually, some of the targets are phenomenal. Like, you know, right now the industry is releasing 70 megatons,
yeah,
per year. And as you mentioned, it goes to a cap of 100.
Yeah.
So that's to cap the whole industry at 100. That's only expecting 40% growth.
Yeah.
And right now we've basically accounted for 20% of it with projects that are in the pipe.
Right.
So to say there's only going to be 20 more % growth in this you know, in this vital industry for Canada.
Yeah.
That's not the case. The industry knows that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's efficiencies to be had. There's technological innovation to be done. You know, this runway is much longer, and they've got that carrot to get there.
Let's talk Neil Young.
Oh yeah, Neil Young.
Yeah.
That's you know, so from our perspective, one of the critical things here was let's address climate change. Let's get emissions down. This does that. You know, and industry has some clarity. You know, we've got a regulatory framework, but more importantly, you know, it also improves brand oil sands, right?
Yeah.
So Neil Young he's come out and said, you know, he was a vocal proponent against Keystone XL. Yeah. You know, he's come out and said this is great. This is phenomenal policy. And yeah, so from our perspective, like when you have vocal critics coming back and saying this is good.
Yeah.
I think that's actually the biggest thing that's come out of this.
Which is interesting because it doesn't get nearly as much coverage.
No, it absolutely should.
On the other side.
Yeah, it's you know, we have a brand problem more than anything, and right now with clarity, you know, with a real plan to get emissions down, that really, you know, builds that brand to say, hey, listen, you know, we're trying to do the same steps in Canada, and we're ahead of the curve.
Let me ask you then, excuse me for coughing, let me ask you about someone who's watching and saying, okay, you know, I hold Cenovus, I hold Canadian Natural Resources, I hold, you know, my basket of energy stocks. What does this mean?
Yeah, so if I could break down exactly what it means, and maybe I could just take it a little step by step, because there's, you know, it was a big document, but I'll explain exactly what it means for the oil sands sector. In particular, what the innovative touch they put in here is benchmarking. So if you are an oil and gas producer and you're first quartile in terms of efficiency, that's a great thing.
Yeah.
You actually won't even be hit by this legislation. So if you're an oil and gas producer in the first quartile, say Cenovus.
And what first quartile of what? So what are you measuring?
Of carbon intensity.
Got it.
So if you can produce that same barrel with less carbon attached to it, and you're in the top quartile of your industry peer group in that particular industry class, you are well positioned. And the idea here is these are real life examples. These are benchmarks. So the idea is it's rewarding the best in class.
Yeah.
And so names like Cenovus, Canadian Natural Resources, they are the best in class.
What do they do that others aren't doing? I mean, again, for the layman who just, what do they do that they're most efficient in the top quartile? I mean, what are they doing?
So it's two pieces, right? So first is you have a fundamentally efficient operation.
Right.
Now that comes down to execution. That comes down to just the quality of the management team and the quality of just operating.
And quality of the resource.
And that's the second piece, right?
Yeah.
The quality of the resource. So Cenovus is a great example. They've got phenomenal resources. So the idea is the combination of the two, you exploit the highest quality resources so you don't have to use as much steam, you don't have to use as much energy, and you're achieving the ultimate goal. Because I think this legislation achieves what investors want as well.
Yeah.
We don't want marginal barrels to be pulled because they don't give us a return.
Right.
We want,
especially in this environment.
Especially in this environment. So when someone says, this is going to debilitate the industry, no, the oil price already did that.
Yeah.
That's already happened. And what this does, the average impact is going to be 50 cents per barrel.
Yeah.
This is not going to break your. If the oil price has already broken your business model, this is not going to change that.
Let me ask you: does it put Canadian energy producers, from a cost basis, at a disadvantage to U.S. energy producers or others? There's a lot of things that already were. I mean, we have the Canadian Select discount and everything else, but
short answer, what we're talking about is a 1% impact.
So no.
Negligible.
So what, as we kind of move forward and we start to see kind of, like I said, the energy efficient first quartile players do what they do, continue doing what they do.
Absolutely.
What about the bottom quartile? What about the third quartile? What happens with that?
A lot of them are,
no names, I'm not going to have you put names.
No, I won't say names. All you have to do is look at their charts.
Yeah.
If their stock charts are already falling off a cliff, chances are that tells you the quality of the resource.
Yeah.
And that kind of tells you their efficiency as well. So bottom line is a lot of those companies are in a lot of trouble already.
Are they somebody that would be potential acquisition targets, or are they just unattractive on the very basis of how they operate to begin with?
They potentially could be. You've got phenomenal operators in Cenovus, Suncor, CNQ. Maybe they could see that. In my own personal view, there's an abundance of resource in these large cap companies that they can continue to build out their strong resource base.
Yeah.
And they don't need to do a lot of that.
Right.
This in my view is an environment of take unders, right?
Yeah.
You're not gonna get a premium.
Yeah.
You're just going to get a lifeline.
Yeah.
At best, right?
And that's what's happening right now. What is going to happen, last question for you, in terms of, so this is more political macro perspective. We've got the deal that came out of Alberta. The premiers have met together. They're getting ready to kind of have a unified position when they go to Paris.
Yeah.
I mean, is there something that's going to happen in Paris that will be beyond Canada saying, hey, good job. You've changed your brand, to your point. Anything else that could come out of it?
Well, I think there's strong momentum going into Paris. So, I think everyone's excited that something can be done at a global level. My own personal view, there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah.
I hope that we do get some answers, because you can't have certain countries with rigid frameworks and others
carbon pricing and others that don't.
Yeah, you can't. And that's the challenge that we're being dealt with today.
Yeah.
So the question is, can we ever be on the same page? Does a U.S. election cycle? Because the bottom line is, Obama can negotiate something that can be turned the other way, in a year and a half time.
Who's next, do you think, in terms of putting forth a climate change policy like this? I know others have priced carbon. I can't tell you off the top of my head. Few and far between. But anybody else you're thinking that could come out? Or?
The U.S. needs something more comprehensive. That's for sure.
Yeah.
The idea is you can't have these patchwork state by state, province by province.
Yeah.
You got to have something that's comprehensive across the board. Something that that if we're going to pay 50 cents per barrel, it would only make sense that shale payers pay the equivalent on a carbon intensity basis.
Yeah. So we'll have to wait to see if that comes.
Absolutely.
Always a pleasure, Thomas.
Thank you very much.
Thomas George with TD Asset Management. He is, of course, the portfolio manager of the TD Energy Fund.